This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Dr. Samuel Gregg his new book, Becoming Europe: Economic Decline, Culture, and How America Can Avoid a European Future. Dr. Gregg is the Director of Research at the Acton Institute and is the author of a number of books. I'll list a few. On Ordered Liberty, The Prize Winning the Commercial Society, and Wilhelm Röpke's Political Economy. He lectures around the world on political economy. His writing regularly appears in academic journals and also National Review, The American Spectator, and Crisis magazine, as well as countless newspapers throughout America, Europe, and Central America. Professor Gregg, glad to have you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's great to be with you.
The title of your book, Becoming Europe, that is something we hear a lot about. Certainly a lot of conservative libertarians in America talk about this fear of America becoming Europe, and I think what they mean is this kind of amalgamation of a flattened society, strong centralized government, vast universal welfare state programs, very little room for entrepreneurs, established businesses receiving a lot of protections from the government. We can kind of go on, but there's just a lot of right and wrongly fear when we hear that. And so precisely what do you mean when you say becoming Europe?
What I really mean is a way that people think about the economy, their attitudes towards the economy, which of course extends into things like their views about the role of government, the role of the Constitution, etc., etc. But when I say Europeanization, what I mean is a cultural dimension to the economy. I mean a culture of expectations, of beliefs, of values and institutions that are embodied in a type of history that's economic, but it's also more than economic. And what I'm really talking about in that sense is the way that particular values will shape the nature of an economy and its workings. So, in the case of Europe, if you have, for example, there many people who are focused upon security at virtually any price, who interpret the idea of solidarity in terms of the welfare state and more or less social democracy, an expectation that the government will provide a cushion against any possible upheaval or change coming from the economy, a certain idea that particular rights should be given some sort of legal and economic status, and that the government is the institution that delivers on those things. So that's really what I'm talking about when I talk about economic Europeanization. I don't literally mean every single institution that we associate with what some people call social Europe or the European social model being replicated in the United States, although that is happening to a certain extent as well. What I am talking about is the pervasiveness of these particular attitudes and the way that it translates into government doing more and more and more in the economy, be it in terms of providing a welfare state, but also in terms of the labor market, in terms of regulation in general, a wariness about risk and a desire to cushion society against the negative effects of market turbulence. All these things, I think, are what I describe as economic Europeanization. And my argument in the book is that this is starting to become more apparent in parts of the United States. In fact, I would argue, and I say this in the book, that some parts of the United States have become more or less economically Europeanized. I'm thinking, for example, of California, but also states like Illinois, where you see a fatal combination of large welfare states, high levels of debt, but also an expectation on the part of the political elites, as well as large segments of the populace, that this is how things should be, that the traditional moorings of American economic culture, with a heavy emphasis upon taking risk, upon entrepreneurship, upon the benefits of market exchange, of a certain role for government, but also a limited role for government. And I argue in the book that over the past 10 years in particular, that positive views of those things within the United States remain, but they have declined significantly over the past 10 years.
You note in the beginning of your book, I mean, this is almost humorous now. I mean, there was once, and I suppose there still are a few people, kind of this positive case for the European Union that was made throughout the 90s and early part of this century, I mean, prior to 2008. You reference a couple of these books, The European Dream, how Europe's vision of the future is quietly eclipsing the American dream. And, I think there is something to be said certainly when Americans travel to Europe, or when you notice things like generous packages, not just social welfare packages, but employment packages that are relatively secure, high pay. There's also this sort of amount of leisure and an element of culture in Europe that seems to bode well for the European Union and the types of policies that European states have pursued over the last few decades. And yet there really is a question now of how they go forward, how they pay for all of these things, which the math just doesn't work. It's really not there to see how they go forward. And I think in large measure that's true, is making the comparisons as you do throughout the book with America and our own system, and also certain states. But you mentioned one, Illinois, but there's also California. I want to read, you explain a lot of the turmoil and I guess also the path dependency in Europe upon a large amount of intervention in the market for various social goals, egalitarian goals, security, economic security, etc., and also in America as well. But you do it through the lens of economic culture, and I wanted you to talk about that. I wanted just to briefly read where you start to address what you mean by economic culture. This is towards the opening of your book on page 3. You say, "To a good number of Americans, the bailout of banks, Congress's apparently insatiable appetite for spending, the passage of Obamacare into law, the new regulatory regime for the financial industry, and the government's rescue of American car companies increasingly looked like a wider pattern." You speak here of the revolt, as it were, that happened in the election of 2010. "Something seemed to be changing, and not for the better, in American economic and political life. This book is about those changes and how they resemble prominent features and trends in Western European economic life. However, you also go on to say, I want to analyze this through the medium of what is called economic culture, that is, the value commitments, attitudes, rules, and institutions that shape and characterize economic life in a given society." And my question for you is, why economic culture, and why not something thinking about, say, citizenship, what citizenship means in America versus various EU states, but also something along the lines of kind of the Tocquevillian framework of a democratic society and its corresponding individualism and equality being a way to think about this sort of slow motion trend of the government spending, upwards of 50-60% of a nation's GDP?
Well, by the idea of economic culture, I mean a number of things. But let me just first say that in basically developing the idea, I actually drew pretty extensively upon Alexis de Tocqueville, because he noticed immediately when he came to the United States that Americans had quite different attitudes towards economic life, and particularly markets and business and commerce, compared to continental Europeans, especially in his native France. So I draw upon him because I think that he is very good at explaining how particular values shape habits and institutions. That's really one of his masterful insights. But there are some economists who have more or less arrived at the same conclusion, and I'm not sure whether they've read de Tocqueville, but it does seem to me that they're down the same path. And I'm thinking of people, for example, like the 1993 Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, when he talks about institutional economics, which is really the study of the nature of institutions and how they develop and their effects upon the economy over long periods of time. Another person who's done extensive work in this area is another Nobel Prize winner, Edmund Phelps. And basically, the argument of people like North and Phelps is that while you can have any number of institutional and policy settings in place, what really drives how an economy develops and the type of form and implications of those institutions are the values and the attitudes and the expectations, and they wrap all that up in this phrase, economic culture. And I think it's very important because I think economists are often portrayed, and sometimes quite accurately, as suffering from a very bad case of mathematics envy. In the sense that values and expectations and attitudes are messy things. They're not as easy to measure as things like GDP or levels of debt and things like that. But it does seem to me that when you drill down, when people like Phelps and people like Douglas North drill down into some of the data, it starts to become very clear that the differences come down to mindsets, to mental models, to the way that people think and act about the economy and their economic preferences and their economic expectations. And they basically say that, for example, Phelps wrote in his 2006 Nobel Prize lecture, he said, various attributes of a country's economic culture, so things like how risk is viewed, how much emphasis is put upon security, what you understand by words like solidarity. He says that essentially various attributes of a country's economic culture serve to animate entrepreneurs and more broadly to encourage them by offering a receptive marketplace for their innovations. And he goes on to say that economic cultures can become entrenched over time in such a way that even if you have significant policy changes and changes in institutions, unless you change the underlying culture, you're going to get a reversion back to what existed before. And it's very interesting to watch, for example, the way that some European heads of government are talking about the economic crisis that Europe is going through right now. Because when people like David Cameron in Britain, for example, when he talks about the need to have austerity, the need to reduce debt, to wind back the welfare state, and it's questioned more how much they're actually doing that, but leaving that aside, they don't portray it in terms of this is our chance to fundamentally reform the way that we think about and do the economy. This is a fundamental chance for us to throw off bad ways of doing things, of expectations that we have, and instead to adopt new attitudes, to prioritize new values, to develop different sets of expectations. No, what you find in Europe is, well, we have to do this now because, things have got a little bit out of control, but once we've gone through a little bit of retrenchment of the state, we can get back to the way things were. So in other words, they know, and maybe they themselves believe, that large segments of European society are simply not receptive at a cultural level to arguments for liberty, for why economic liberty matters, why it's good to take risk, why entrepreneurship goes beyond just the economic good it creates, but also the general human flourishing that it promotes. So it is okay, of course, to look at some of the things that you mentioned, things like concepts of citizenship, concepts of the role of democracy. But even those, I think, can get wrapped in very easily to this idea of economic culture, because economic culture, in some respects, also shapes people's conceptions of what it means to be a citizen and the nature of democracy. And one of my arguments in the book is that if you think that citizenship is about how much I can get out of the state at other people's expense, then you head very quickly down the path of economic Europeanization. And so you get this very, very dangerous linkage between expectations, democratic systems of government, and the type of welfare systems that you put in place. And once you have that sort of dynamic in place, it's very difficult to break out of it. That's why I think, for example, California and Illinois are having immense difficulty changing their situation, precisely because you have this set of expectations in place on the part of the elites and the people, and the citizens, so to speak. You have a large welfare state, and you have democratic mechanisms that allow those expectations to be transformed through the political process to shape the way that the economy works. And in the case of California and Illinois, and many countries in Western Europe, it's turned out to be an economic disaster.
I appreciated your discussion of Douglas North's ideas, because I agree with you. There is this kind of notion out there that institutions, good institutions, just kind of emerge and maintain themselves on autopilot or automatically course correct, et cetera. And then they really don't. I mean, the one is, where do they come from, and then how are they maintained? How do you prevent collusion, deterioration, breakdown? The citizenship point, I think, is a good one. And you you develop aspects of this, I think, in your book. Citizenship in America seems to me original principles, a willful choice, a willful election to come here on the basis of self-interest, property, the ability to maneuver according to your own lights and not necessarily be dictated to. So there's something just inherently we could say there's something bottom up about citizenship that, and you mentioned one good book, Crevecoeur's Letters from a French Farmer, but also thinking also of something else that you mentioned, which is a market culture and a guild culture, and which I thought was interesting and gives us a way, and in a way the historical analysis of Europe in your book, of Europe's political economy and economic culture, helps us to understand that perhaps the 20th century is maybe just a further pressing of past episodes of government intervention for a range of objectives that have happened in Europe's history. You mentioned the absolutist age, 1600s, 17th century, 18th century. Well, let me ask you, the guild culture, you seem to not focus so much on things like socialism and ideology as explaining these manifestations. I mean, that's certainly there. But this historical development of economic and income protection for some and exclusion of others.
Yes, I argue in the book that what you see throughout the West in general, and more particularly in Western Europe, from about the Middle Ages, is a constant struggle between what I call market economic culture and guild economic culture. Now, by marketing economic culture, I mean things like personal security in the sense of freedom from arbitrary passions of others, freedom of private property, protection of property against seizure, rule of law, notions of equal rights before the law, etc., etc. By guild culture, I mean something quite different. By guild culture, what I mean is things like a focus upon equality of outcome, a heavy emphasis upon security for those who are members of the club, so to speak. Rules and regulations that stipulate things ranging from what you can produce, how much you can produce, where you can produce it. Now, if you look at medieval economic history, what you soon see clearly is that you have market economic culture and guild economic culture to a certain degree overlapping with each other, but they're also in conflict as well. I think, for example, many people would be surprised that in the Middle Ages, bishops and theologians, including people like Thomas Aquinas, were very, very critical of guilds because they saw guilds as monopolistic, as organizations that prevented people from taking risk, that were suspicious of entrepreneurship, etc., etc. They were very, very, and they also damaged rule of law. And so many bishops and theologians wrote extensively against what might be called guilds and guild economic culture and guild attitudes and guild expectations. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that in many respects in Western Europe, what you see is a playing out of back and forth between these two forms of economic culture. I argue, for example, that after the Reformation, what you see is a shift towards absolutist forms of government, and absolutist forms of government tended to favor guild economic culture. Why? Because they're all about control. They're all about top-down control of society. Then in the late 18th and 19th century, you see a shift back towards market economic culture, and that's predominantly facilitated by books like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but also the basic workings of what Adam Smith called the mercantile system were starting to break down by the late 18th century. Then I argue that at the beginning of the 20th century, you start to see a shift back towards this more state-orientated, guild-orientated, corporatist-orientated economic culture. Now, I have to say that in this context, it's very important to remember that I don't think you can understand the longing of Western Europeans in particular in the 20th century and in the early 21st century, their longing for security. I don't think you can downplay enough the role of two incredibly destructive world wars, devastation of an extent that I think many Americans find difficult to comprehend. We're talking about periods in which fascism and communism were real live political systems in much of Western Europe. we're talking about unimaginable things being done to people by other people. So to that extent, I think it's true to say that particular circumstances of the 20th century have shifted, maybe even permanently, many Western Europeans' mindsets towards embracing this state-orientated, highly centralized, guild/corporatist economic culture. Because if you're a Western European and you've lived through the horrors and the totalitarianisms and the extent of war that you find in 20th century Europe, it's not surprising that most Western Europeans opt for security over liberty. Whenever I'm in Europe, I always ask the question, what do people think you prefer? Is it liberty or security? And Europeans overwhelmingly choose security. So I just say that as a historical point because I think that maybe the 20th century may have been enough to cement in place these attitudes, this guild economic culture, which is accompanied by this top-down, centralized mentality about how you run the economy, how society operates vis-a-vis the economy. I think that what we're seeing is, in some respects, it's going to be very, very difficult for market economic culture to push back against this.
Interesting in this respect, you note, and we've discussed previously when you've been on with your work on Wilhelm Röpke, the West German economic miracle. There was this space. I mean, thinking about your comments about it, and I agree with the devastating effects of two world wars on the European continent, but there was this space when West Germany really was something, we could say, with neoliberal policies, neoliberal ideas seemed to be guiding their policies. And it worked rather well. I guess also the West German Constitution was, and we can get into this, explicitly designed, my understanding, around a corporatist mentality. Groups are largely, being represented and are at the table in all sorts of ways. Persons, individuals are considered in a different light. And thinking also, when we discuss the European Union, part of this as well is, really the continuation of something you talk at length in the book about, which is there are markets. There is private property, obviously, in Europe. There's free transactions. Of course, there's the government supplying a lot of terms to your contracts, et cetera. But there is something like a host of interventions, and the European Union kind of continues this, while at the one level knocking down barriers to trade, knocking down barriers to the mobility of labor and capital, but yet maintaining the dirigist policies you speak of pursuing the social model of Europe now in a transnational sense. But of course, World War II, as you've been discussing, is a part of this because it shakes the faith in the nation state, which seems, and not that nation states necessarily are going to be more conducive to the ideas we're talking about, but there is a sense, I think, where if you look at Europeans, certainly they seem to be ambivalent about the European Union. There doesn't seem to be a lot of energy in its behalf, yet those working in the European Union very aggressively asserting its prerogatives and powers. And yet I wonder, is there's just kind of an overall sense when Europeans think about the European Union that they don't like it, but they're not necessarily willing to do anything about it, and so they've kind of accepted this political articulation that largely removes any sort of accountability or citizenship from their hands.
Well, I think it's true to say that if you look at the European Union and the way that it's developed over the past, 50, 60 years, it's important to remember that it doesn't really change Europeans' mindsets regarding the role of the state. It is true that the European Union is not particularly popular in some segments of Europe, particularly, for example, countries like Britain, for example. But generally speaking, it's not as if the state itself has been the source of great love and admiration on the part of Europeans either. What is clear, however, is that this sort of acquiescence in the role of the state, an extensive, interventionist, highly regulative state, has been very much part of European culture in general, I would argue since the late Middle Ages, although it really accelerates after the Reformation. So it's not as if bureaucrats working for absolutist monarchies in France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, any of these countries during the 18th century was somehow popular people, but there was this basic acquiescence in what was going on. And I think you find that in the European Union itself today, that there is this same mentality of, well, we don't like it, but we don't really know of any alternative, and all the alternatives that might be out there, like a more shift towards more open economies, that's unacceptable. To many Europeans, that's just completely unacceptable. They call it Americanization, they use words like savage capitalism, etc., etc. So I think there is this type of deference towards the government and the state in much of Western Europe that you don't necessarily find replicated in large swathes of American political and economic culture. Now, that said, what is also true is that the state in Europe is viewed as the province of insiders. Insiders in the sense that if you look at, literally, even in our very democratic age, if you look at European politics, in many countries, it's basically dominated by very small groups of people. Some of these people have literally gone to the same higher educational institutions as each other. I'm thinking, for example, particularly of the École Grande, the great schools in France, where basically everyone who wants to be in politics or at the senior levels of business or senior levels of the civil service, they've all gone to these places, whether they're from the right or from the left. You even find that in some countries that entire families more or less dominate large swathes of European political life. I actually go through at one point in the book and just list who's related to who on the left and on the right in many European countries. And what you find is that people have, Greece is maybe the most extreme example, where the previous Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou, his father was Prime Minister of Greece. His grandfather was Prime Minister of Greece, and he's a socialist. But if you look at the opposition leader at the time, well, he was the nephew of someone who had spent 4 terms as Prime Minister and then had been the President of the Greek Republic. But if you go through the whole of European politics, what you find is this replication of family ties and political ties in a way that is very small in terms of numbers of people, but extremely controlling when it comes to the political life of the country. And what this means is that whether people are on the right or on the left, is that the elites more or less think the same way about the economy. So when you look at, for example, the right in Europe, what you generally find is that they are more or less okay with broadly social democratic economic policies. Their differences with the left-wing political parties are not that great when it comes to these particular issues. But we shouldn't be surprised, because these people don't know of any alternatives. They're taught the same things at the same institutions that they go to, and that the people that they encounter in their everyday life think exactly the same way. So to that extent, Europe is very much dominated by what I call insiders. And there are outsiders, of course, that suffer as a consequence of this. Entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs are a good example. Immigrants are blocked out of extensively controlled labor markets. Consumers, taxpayers, etc. All these people are outsiders because they're not part of this inside group that essentially runs the European Union and most domestic politics at the level of the nation state. Yeah. So while the state in itself is important, I think it's important also to remember that the way that the state is controlled and who controls the state in Europe helps to explain why they are so reluctant to change, to move away from this top-down, heavily centralized guild approach, corporate approach to organizing economic life, and to move towards, let's call it, a more market-orientated approach.
Funny, when I read that part of your book, which I thought was an important part, where you were discussing this sort of tight relationships of political control. I wrote in the margins the Washington-New York axis, what some have called the New York-Washington corridors of power, which seemed to really be evident in 2008 in the sense of people, primarily people in political control at the federal level, being corporate lawyers, bankers, and also are having worked in major federal institutions most of their life. And it seemed to me there is a comparison, although it's obviously there's a different level of a problem. I mean, it seems to me elites in American political life do have fundamental disagreements about the scope and size of the state and what it should do. We just had a fairly vigorous presidential election, although even there we saw somewhat of a reluctance to make these sorts of principled arguments I think you're articulating. And so I thought about that with regard to American life. And of course, you note several family dynasties as well. In America, but of course, then again, we come back to, I don't think there's the level of intellectual agreement, although there is this sort of same, increasingly, as Charles Murray documents, there's this kind of a very similar sociological profile amongst elites on the right and the left in America. But also, I want to talk about, when you write about Europe, I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking about the size of the social welfare state, but I thought it was also good, just returning to the market and guild narrative you write about, in that it really moves against the creation of a constituency for more market-centered, limited government-type policies, because everyone, in a certain sense, not just the person receiving vast amounts of the dole, but even those working for large corporations, those leading large corporations, have, in a sense, a stake in the system, and everyone kind of knows it. So I thought, that seemed to me something it's almost an intractable feature that how you move beyond, I don't really know.
Yes, I think in the case of, let's just talk about the political dynamics in America first. I think it is true to say that America does have some of those same political dynamics in the sense of a certain degree of control by a certain number of insiders. The difference, I think, the big difference is one. First of all, these political dynasties and political groups in America have enormous difficulty replicating themselves beyond one generation. In Europe, it's quite different. They go on and on and on and on. The second thing is that in Europe, there are protocols and institutions that are hardwired into the political system to maintain this status quo, to maintain this heavy degree of control by the same people, regardless of whether they come from left and right. And thirdly, as you mentioned, there is, even among now, there is still substantive political debate among the political elites in America about what is the right course to follow. It's, you can be a relatively successful senator and an outspoken pro-marketer. You can't really do that in Western Europe. But to move to your second point about the welfare state, I think that the person who most impresses me in terms of his thinking about this issue is the German economist Wilhelm Röpke, who wrote a lot about the welfare state, and very early in the piece, much more earlier than many other people who were commentating upon this at the same time. And what he basically said was that the welfare state generates its own logic, and there's really no way to put a cap on it once you accept the basic premise. And he argues that essentially what happens is that politicians have a stake in the system because it allows them to build up constituencies of people who will vote for them on a particularly reliable basis. That sounds rather familiar to some parts of the United States. But also the paying for the welfare state reduces the amount of disposable income of those who might be inclined to adopt other policies or to support other policies because their level of income is being taken down, and they start looking to the welfare state for a substantial portion of their income either now or sometime in the near future. But there's other things that I think cause people to buy in Europe into the welfare state in a way which is quite profound. And I think that it's not just things like payments, literal payments or entitlements. It's also things like the way that people retire and when they retire and what funds their retirement. Or things like how many hours they work, or how many vacations they have. Because I think when it comes to the welfare state, we need to move away from thinking strictly about Social Security. When Europeans talk about the welfare state, what they really have in mind is the social model. And what they mean by that is social insurance on all sorts of levels of society, labor security policies, by which they mean extensive labor market regulation. They mean subsidies either on the basis of a person's income or because there are certain inequities perceived to be in society or because you belong to a certain occupational category. but also different types of services that are offered to people, things like socialized medicine being a very good example. So now there's differences within Europe about how that operates. There's the Scandinavian model, there's the Bismarckian model, but nonetheless what you find is that more or less there is consensus within Europe that this is all good, that this very expansive notion of the idea of welfare largely administered by the state, and by welfare, as I said, I don't literally mean just entitlements. I also mean things like particular regulations and protections that are accorded to people because they work in an industry or they earn a certain level of money or whatever. So everyone to a certain extent is required to buy into it. And that means that people, as time goes on, become more and more and more reluctant to question it. So, for example, just recently there was a survey done in Britain of people's attitudes towards the National Health Service. The National Health Service being something that was created by Clement Attlee in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was going to be there to basically take care of everyone's healthcare needs. Well, the attitudes of British people today towards the National Health Service are extremely positive. They often describe it as the jewel in our crown. It's a wonderful achievement. But it's bankrupt. But it's literally bankrupt. And they also employ far more bureaucrats than they do actually employ health staff. So despite the clear economic dysfunctionality of the system, its inability to deliver health care in a way that's efficient, affordable, but also accessible, many Europeans, they just don't care about that. What matters is this generic commitment to security through the state. And if that's the attitude that people have, then they are going to put up with highly inefficient, dysfunctional social welfare systems for long periods of time. And that again shows you the influence of economic culture in shaping people's mindsets towards things, even when it's not working, even when the evidence is very clear that a system is economically broken. If the economic culture is such that security is seen as being coming through the state, people don't care. They will just keep going with this system. And I'm not sure myself how you break out of that mentality. Maybe the solution is that things have to get so bad that some people among the elites realize that some degree of change has to occur. And I do talk about that in the book. There are two examples of where that's happened. One is Germany in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the other case is that of Sweden, where things got so bad that even left-wing political parties realized that things simply couldn't keep going the way that they were going.
Canada,
now, the problem with what's that?
Canada would be another interesting.
Yes. People would just buy into the system, and they'll just happily put up with all this because they have this value commitment to security through the state, or solidarity, as Europeans like to say, solidarity which is exercised not by me helping my neighbor, but by the state on my behalf or on behalf of the body politic. There's some part of some fictitious social contract taking care of everyone on behalf of everyone.
Sam, I just wanted to jump in real fast. When you mentioned Rupka, and you mentioned this sort of once there's a principled commitment to democratic politics being about providing material security to people, there really is no limit to the welfare state. Rupka also makes this point, which I thought is one worth discussing as well, and that is solidarity. And that is the welfare state leads to a breakdown in solidarity. Although solidarity is one of those words like social justice. Usually when you hear it, you start to cringe. You know what people really mean by that. But yet, welfare states, Rupka says, break that sort of assimilating principle. If we want to give it a better way to think about it, assimilating principle within a society, uniting people together in some sort of principled way. Seems to eliminate that or attenuate it. And of course, that seemed to be the case in Greece. Even now, there is one level of refusal, it seems, from what you see in protests, to take any sort of responsibility for what's happened, and also sort of a internecine, not bloodbath, but certainly a lot of fighting internally over who's cutting who's getting cut, et cetera, instead of just being able to collectively address a problem. But also, I do want to move on, and when you talk about the solidarity, but also I want to move on into problems that I think are comparative between America and Europe regarding population and the youth?
Well, let me just say, first of all, about the solidarity issue. You know, solidarity, strictly speaking, is simply a modern way of articulating the Christian principle that one should love one's neighbor as oneself. And now the way that Americans have lived effectively solidarity is through the habit of free association. De Tocqueville talked about this extensively, where he said, you know, Europeans, even on a very local level, look automatically to Paris or Berlin to fix an immediate local problem. That's solidarity. Tocqueville noticed that Americans would do this by banding freely together in free associations to take care of a problem. Once the problem was fixed, they would either disband or they would move on and do something different. So the way that Europe, it's not that solidarity, the idea that one should have a concern for one's neighbor, to my mind, that is the problem. The problem is the way that it gets institutionalized. In the case of Europe, it's been institutionalized in terms of the state. The state is the one that actualizes solidarity. In America, it's still the case, despite Obamacare, despite the expansion of government over the past 10 years, despite progressivism, that Americans still will band together in free associational ways, particularly through religious organizations, to deal with any number of social problems. And Europeans find this very difficult to understand. But de Tocqueville said, you know, Americans talk about this in terms of their own rational self-interest, but he said, I think they're doing themselves a disservice. They're doing this because they actually care about their neighbor in a very personal, associative way rather than in a collectivist and status way. Now, what is interesting in Europe, as you mentioned, is that it's clearly that this sense of oneness, this sense of being together in for it all, in the sense of solidarity, is breaking down rapidly. And it's not just in terms of different interest groups lining up against each other, business versus unions, insiders versus outsiders, etc., etc. It's also manifesting itself generationally. So, for example, in 2010, 2011, we saw on our television screens thousands of young people in countries like Portugal and Spain and France and Germany and Italy, but particularly Spain, marching through the streets, occupying squares. You know, it had resonance to some of the Occupy Wall Street things that happened in America. But you saw all this phenomena developing in Europe in 2010, 2011. But it wasn't as if these young people, and let's keep in mind that some of them live in countries where the youth unemployment rate is 55%. It's not as if young people in Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and other countries are arguing for a more market economy. They're not it's not as if they're arguing for lower labor market regulation. It's not as if they're pleading for a winding back of trade union power and corporatist protocols that keep the labor market tightly controlled and make it very difficult for people to enter. It's not as if they're calling for labor market reforms that make it easier for employers to fire people, because one of the problems in Europe is that employers are reluctant to hire people because once you do, it's almost impossible to fire someone. No, it's not as if young people in Europe were arguing for these things. No. What they were arguing for was exactly the same things that their parents have. In other words, they want more labor market regulation. They want a job for life. They want high wages, apparently, and not too many questions asked how this is all paid for, etc., etc. So they want all this stuff. So they're really status quo-narians. They're not social revolutionaries at all. Now, if you look at the United States and you make the comparison with, say, some of the young people that were involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement, some of the studies of their attitudes show that more or less they had generally social democratic views of what they thought the economy should be like. They were often from people who came from highly socially fragmented settings and backgrounds. In other words, they didn't have the associative habits that Tocqueville talked about when he visited the United States. So in the long term, in terms of people's political preferences and their values and their attitudes and expectations and how they play out in the economy, I think both Europe and America have some significant problems because, if anything, young people in Europe and America tend to embrace more or less social democratic priorities when it comes to thinking about these issues.
What I found was surprising thinking about the youth, because I've also been thinking thinking of long-term self-interest and thinking about as a young person myself, how does one achieve that. And in America, it's surprising to me. I mean, it's not overwhelming, but you think about Occupy Wall Street, but think about more mainstream, just college students in America, recent college graduates, finding themselves, as we read, without a lot of opportunities, and yet their political ideas, who they're voting for, and really not questioning this. And that's surprising to me, given that they grew up in America. They grew up in America shaped by, shall we say, not the Reagan Revolution, but certainly the Reagan way of thinking that he launched, the deregulatory wave that emerged in this country in the 70s and the 80s, and the lowering taxes, and the failure to connect problems with policies amongst the young in America, I think has been surprising. It's not as surprising to me as in Europe, I think, as we've already touched upon. What else? I mean, this sounds paternalistic, but what else do they really know? Practices and habits are very different. Things have been formed by different. Their ideas have been formed by different institutions. Their lives have been formed by these sorts of economically secure policies. I wanted to ask you about demographics as well. Now, you write America is in a better position, and I think that's true up until maybe a couple of years ago. From what I've been reading, we now are below replacement level. And anyway, most of the increase came through immigration, certainly not. It wasn't as if the native population in America seemed to have an above or that sort of hopeful commitment to the future you see in family and marriage and children, and even the rates of marriage. Some would say are declining in America and in a really strong rate. So this is a problem. It's a much greater problem in Europe, particularly given they're in the ones. I mean, you kind of laid this out. Like Poland is 1.2. The best, I think, is Ireland, maybe France. So this is a problem, and there's also a philosophical issue. I think the cult of the individual that is hard to break or hard to overcome, I think, in terms of people thinking about being married and having children. Of course, there's all sorts of economic welfare state incentives as well.
Yes, I think it's true to say that with demographics, I think there's things going on at the level of policy, and there are things going on at the level of values and expectations. So, for example, in the case of Europe, there's really no question in my mind that welfare states act as a type of economic disincentive to have children, because once upon a time before welfare states, people would have larger families for all sorts of reasons, but one reason was that it would mean there would be children around to look after them in their old age. Well, the welfare state basically breaks that generational connection, and it says, no, it doesn't matter how many children you have, the welfare state will take care of you. And that creates what some economists call a free rider problem, in the sense that there are plenty of Europeans who have one or maybe two, and more often than not, no children. And yet, if you have a pay-go welfare system whereby each generation pays for the preceding generation, if you don't have children, then sooner or later that pay-go system is going to start to break down. But we shouldn't be surprised, because a welfare system basically incentivizes people not to have children. That sounds very cold and clinical, but as I outline in the book, the evidence for this is quite clear. But at another level, there's also attitudes and expectations. Now, if you grow up in a society where you're told that all that matters is the here and now, that the future is not so important, that you don't really owe anything to your parents or to your children because the state's there to take care of you, or you're just who you are and you can do whatever the hey you want, we shouldn't be surprised to see that people stop making commitments in terms of lifelong commitments. They're wary about getting married. They view children as a burden rather than something that is given to them as a gift, or as something that, just in economic terms is going to create wealth, etc., etc. So it is true, I think, that because these things are much more far gone in Europe, that they're much further down this path than the United States. But you're also right. I do point out in the book that up until relatively recently, America was doing okay in this regard, but our birth rate has also started to drop, and it's been exacerbated, I think, by the effects of the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent recession. And the gap has been more or less filled with immigration. Now, as long as America keeps taking large numbers of immigrants, and these immigrants are young and they want to work, etc., then to a certain extent, the demographic challenges can be met. But Europe, of course, has some huge challenges in this area because they do have people moving to Europe for immigration. They move about 1 million people a year move to the European Union, mainly from North Africa and the Middle East, seeking work. But the problem is they get there, they can't get work because labor markets are so tight. They often are low skilled. They don't have the same language skills as people who are from the native-born population. So they basically gravitate very quickly towards the welfare state. Now, you don't have that happening as much in most of America, although there have been recent studies showing that in places like California, disproportionately, much more disproportionately than you would expect, numbers of immigrants and even first-generation immigrants are heavily dependent upon the welfare state. And that's partly because of political dynamics, people playing identity politics games, trying to get votes on the basis of identity, and we will give you this stuff if you vote for us, etc., etc. So while America is in a better place demographically, both in terms of policies, but also, what I would argue, in terms of attitudes towards immigration as well, than Europe, it's not as if America is not starting in some parts of the country to experience some of the negative demographic trends. And, you know, California, again, another example. It has an extremely low birth rate. So it has extremely low birth rate, large numbers of immigrants who are going on welfare. That sounds like
that's interesting.
Europe.
I mean, that's interesting. A large number. I mean, I've thought this as well. A large number of immigrants into California, yet the low birth rate. You know, one wonders if the welfare state already works that rapidly, in the sense of, or if there's an American sort of cultural ethos that seeps in, even in the first, second generation of immigrants, leading them to decline in terms of their birth rates.
Yes. Well, when you have this dynamic of democratic systems of government, substantial welfare states, but also a political class and a certain degree of citizens that decide that they're going to play identity politics because they see it as mutually beneficial, then we shouldn't be surprised that they end up in the fiscal disaster that is the state of California. And we shouldn't also be surprised that the birth rate starts to drop as well.
Yeah. In terms of going forward, so thinking of, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is kind of thinking, I guess, a time for truth, to use William Simon's phrase from the 1970s. Is there any way, or do you see the ability to make this case and for it to catch on outside of an emergency situation in either America or Europe? And let's not forget, I mean, America is correctly saying our welfare state is more of a patchwork thing, and yet it can't be paid for. It cannot continue in the way it is, the way it presently exists. So that raises the question, I think, of how do you really make this case to the public when really even you don't see people willing to accept, with regard to Social Security and Medicare, that their contributions do not equal what they cash out of the system.
Yes, I talk a lot about this in the last chapter of the book, Chapter 9. It's called How America Can Have a Non-European Future. And basically, I think there is hope for America. I am not a pessimist. Now, there is a negative side in the sense that on one level, it does seem that while many Americans will say things like, I'm for free enterprise, I like the market economy, I don't want to have European-style social democratic policies here, when it comes to actually cashing that out in terms of concrete policies, things like winding back Social Security, trying to move away from a socialized medical system, etc., then Americans will articulate a different response. Something like there's some polls of some of these questions done in the 2011, and what they found is that while something like even 1 in 2 members of the Tea Party refused to contemplate any significant changes to Social Security. They just refused. Now, if that's how that segment of the population thinks, then we have a problem, because there's a mismatch between what people say they value and are committed to, and the types of attitudes and policies that are played out in the political and public policy arena. There's a disjunct in America about these particular things. Does this mean it's impossible? No, I don't think so. Why? Because on the one hand, what America has, which Europe does not have, is reference points whereby it can go back and check itself and say, is this what the founders of the Republic wanted for this United States, this experiment in ordered liberty? Is this what they wanted? Would they have wanted things like Obamacare? Would they have wanted a large entitlement system? Would they have wanted extensive labor market regulation? Well, the answer to all those questions is no, 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 and no. It's very clear. The founders had a vision which remains, I think, quite operative in American politics today. It's very difficult for American politicians to try and to denigrate that or pretend it's not there. So that's one thing. So you have that reference point, but you need two other things besides that. You need also enough political leaders who are capable of articulating that message in a positive and attractive way, so that it doesn't come across as naysaying, but rather comes across as articulating a wonderful vision of human liberty and human flourishing. And you need that vision to resonate among large segments of the population. And I think large segments of that population do still exist in the United States. But you need this sort of this combination of the right type of leaders who are capable of articulating these messages, and enough citizens who are willing to say, no, we do not want to become Europe, but more importantly, we're willing to make and accept the changes that go along with that. That, I think, is the critical dynamic. Ronald Reagan, to a certain extent, did that in the 1980s. But I think it's true to say that on the center-right of American politics, we're still looking for the right type of leader. And it's also true on the center-right of American politics that a lot of politicians and a lot of people who call themselves conservatives or free marketers have more or less bought into the sort of neo-social democratic-like policies that have been emanating from Washington for a while now. But I'd also outline in the book that people need to make some fundamental value choices, because if it's values and attitudes and expectations that drive an economic culture in particular directions, then I think it's true to say that Americans need to make some fundamental choices about what things they value, and understanding that if you value one thing, it means you can't value another. So I say things like they need to value rule of law over the rule of men. They need to value wealth creation over wealth redistribution. They need to value accountability and transparency over falsehood. They need to be willing to attach more value to property rights and the bottom-up approach to an economy instead of top-down dirigism, which involves extensive coordination and regulation of one's private property by the state. So I think those are sort of the value trade-offs that people need to make. But also I think that it needs to be invigorated and underpinned by a vision of human flourishing, that it's not good for the person, it's not good in terms of their growth and flourishing as a human being to be dependent on welfare. It's not good for a society to drift into what de Tocqueville called soft despotism. It's not good to be heavily dependent on the state. And I'm not just talking materially, I'm talking morally as well. And in fact, that in the free economy, there are numerous opportunities for human flourishing in a way that do not exist in the European social model or more or less social democratic systems. So it's got to be more than just an economic argument about what works and what doesn't. It's also got to be about which is the vision of human development that you want. One in which people make choices, in which there's enormous opportunities for human flourishing because people are free and they're able to know and recognize truths that they assimilate into their lives in the very process of working in business and commerce or whatever. Or do they want to opt for the deadening hand of security at any price through the state, the cost of which is that you basically give up your liberty and your opportunities for authentic human flourishing get narrowly constricted? That's the sort of fundamental value choice that Americans need to make. And I think in America, there's still time for people and society and the political class to make that type of choice. I'm not sure that's the case in Europe.
Dr. Gregg, I think this is a wonderful way to end. The book is Becoming Europe: Economic Decline, Culture, and How America Can Avoid a European Future. The author, Samuel Gregg. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.